r/Nosleep. Posted by u/ViaCreepy. I work as a guard on a graveyard. Now, if you've read the title, then you're probably wondering why would a graveyard need a guard? The easy answer would probably be, to keep the graves safe from vandalism? At least that's what my employees tell the city. It's an easy lie to believe, to be honest. The graveyard itself is the largest in the area, and it's divided into a modern and a historical part. Down the hill in the lower part, people are still being laid to rest. The graves are new and look quite beautiful if you ask me. We never really stuck to the whole linear idea of aligning graves next to each other, which might make it all look a little random at times, but it does give the place a better possibility of growing flowers and trees between and above the graves. It looks more like a growing forest with graves in between, than a carefully crafted place of mourning. The upper part is historical. The oldest grave we have is from 1805, but we can't be absolutely sure, since some of the others have lost their headstones by now, or the numbers and names are so washed out that you can only guess how old they possibly are. Most of them, however, are from the 19th and 20th century. The most impressive ones are possibly the huge family crypts, which look like small houses above the ground. The saddest ones are possibly the mass graves for soldiers from both World Wars, as well as the Napoleon Wars. The whole graveyard itself is huge. And by huge, I mean around 200k square meters. A lot of ground to cover. A guy named Joshua had the lower part, while I had the upper part. We walked our rounds almost every night. I only took days off when uni demanded too much of my attention or my family demanded my presence during other jobs. You see, I didn't pick this job because I was particularly drawn to walking around in the dark with a flashlight. Well, that too, it's more like my family is traditionally involved in topics like this. Graveyards. Occult stuff. I'm the first one to actually go to uni additionally and make something of my life. I'm studying psychology. I'm going to earn money which is not inherited from whichever wild traditions my parents and grandparents are clinging onto and which they're so desperately trying to pull me into. But I'm also not going to stop doing this here. Because this is what I'm good at. Watching over the dead. Walking among graves which are falling apart at the seams, dusting leaves off stones which are cracked apart by growing trees, reading and memorizing names and dates which are fading away with every passing winter. I think there is something incredibly beautiful about graveyards. Especially old ones. And I'm not particularly speaking about the aesthetic. I mean the atmosphere. There is always a feeling of peace in the air. As if someone is standing right behind you, appreciating that you're taking an interest in what their name used to be, even though their headstone might be falling apart. A few nights ago, it was one of the warmer nights. While I appreciate being able to walk around without a jacket and all, it usually means that a lot more people will try to enter the graveyard past sundown. While the modern part is open to the public basically 24/7, the historical part closes off after 10 p.m. It is however not divided by any sort of fence, which is why I usually have to walk the line between the two parts more frequently in the hours between 10 p.m. to 1 a.m., sending teens back down the hill again or telling older folks that they'll have to take one of the lower exits again instead of walking through the upper parts. Some get rude, but usually they do what I say pretty quickly. I'm a 1.80 meters goth at night on a graveyard with actual credentials to be there. They don't usually want to pick a fight over something so incredibly petty. And let's just say, this graveyard has a reputation. My family may be the only occult one in the area, but we're certainly not the only ones who know what can happen here. Locals have accepted it. Some say it's just our minds playing tricks because the graveyard looks like from a horror film at night. Some say there is definitely something supernatural going on, but it doesn't affect them, so why would they care? And some just don't enter the grounds past nightfall. Outsiders, however. A few years ago, there was some medium coming here with a TV crew following her and all that. The lady walked across the graveyard by day and told stories I've never heard of, even though I grew up here and I've been studying the histories of those graves all my life. Then she came back by night, touched one of the crypts and completely lost it basically on live TV. She was a crying mess by the end of the show and as far as I know, was admitted to the hospital for hysteria, but thankfully got to leave the next day again. But anyways, I was talking about the night a few days ago. Like I mentioned, it was warm, I had left my jacket at home and was carrying a water bottle with me. Bottle in one hand, flashlight in the other. I had been over 37 degrees Celsius that day and even though it was past midnight, it still wasn't colder than maybe 28 C? I don't like heat. I especially don't like heat at night. The birds were quiet, but the sounds of crickets was filling the air so loudly, I was considering to put headphones in and drown them out with music. Joshua had said goodbye at the gate and I had given him a quick wave, before heading onto my usual path, where I was sitting on one of the benches now. Past 1 a.m. was usually the time when I took my first break and just sat down, took in the atmosphere around me and ate a sandwich or something similar. That particular day, I was sitting next to the grave of Agnes Merks. Born 1843, died January 1905. She had been buried with her husband and 4 children, although the grave itself looked rather small to fit 6 coffins inside. Maybe some were urns. It didn't really matter. I drank my water and ate my sandwich, listening to the wind rattle through the trees above me. Down the hill, I could occasionally see Joshua's flashlight, but most of the time it was obscured from me by all the trees and family crypts. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. I probably should have noticed things sooner, but I didn't. Which is why I take all the blame. I left Agnes and her family be after about half an hour of rest and instead decided to make my way towards the area with the large family crypts. You see, a lot of families are buried together. Either in the same grave, or at least in graves next to each other. And if you're wealthy enough, you can actually pay for one of those fancier crypts, where you have a doorway leading down into an underground room where all the coffins can be placed behind stone in the wall. Now, the ones we have in this particular area, are on a whole another level. They look like small houses. The bigger ones of them are definitely larger than my student flat is. They have statues, they have carvings, they look like they were built in Roman times with their columns and all that. I guess some people just can't stop showing the world exactly how much money they have. Even after death. I mean, go off, I guess. I do have to say though, I like this area the most. It's not as fundamentally packed with sadness like the war areas are, and not as loaded with calm familiarity like the usual old graves which take up the rest of the space. They're just so over the top that I never did manage to build up an emotional connection to any of the names written here, which makes it a lot more entertaining to look at them. I think it was around 2:30 a.m. when I started to feel weird. Weird in the sense of, something was off and I knew it, but I couldn't quite place my finger onto it yet. I shut my flashlight off and started looking around, carefully turning on the spot I was standing. The sound of the crickets had stopped almost completely, or at least it had quieted down so much, that I could only faintly hear it in the distance. A cool breeze was blowing and I suddenly wished I had brought my jacket after all. I wasn't panicking or anything like that. I calmly waited for whatever wanted to emerge right now, whatever wanted to be seen, be heard. Ghosts aren't fundamentally evil. They are born from many things. Sadness which isn't letting them go. Passion which acts like an anchor. Anger which keeps them from moving on. And so on. Strong emotions of any kind can produce a ghost, and in the most cases, they just want it to be seen, to be heard, have a shoulder to cry on perhaps, have someone who tells them it's alright to move on, that everyone is safe. Ghosts in the war area of the graveyard were usually born from panic. From an amount of fear we living will never be able to understand. I have spent many nights calming them down, telling them how the war ended. I've researched hundreds of names so far, in order to find relatives and family histories, so I can tell them what happened to their loved ones after they themselves were gone. If the stories weren't pretty, I claimed to be unable to find them. But I wasn't near the war graves now. I was standing between the tall family crypts, where ghosts were usually born from passion or sadness. And yet, I still felt a bone-deep panic seep into me. As if I was being watched. As if someone wanted to jump out from where they had been hiding and drive a knife through my ribs. I turned again. The gravel crunched below my feet and I stopped moving self-conscious. It's not like ghosts can't sense you, but they don't have a supernatural way of tracking you either. It's more of a feeling, I think. "Let me help you," a voice whispered, and I whirled around, my breathing picking up when I saw the dark, barely visible figure of a young man standing mere meters away from me. He didn't move, and neither did I. No need to provoke each other, I guess. Ghosts don't glow in the dark. No matter what TV shows and cartoons are trying to tell you, they don't glow blue or white. They also don't look like normal, physically present people either. They're just like shadows. Figments of what they once were. As if you turned down the opacity of the main layer in an art program and stripped them of most of the other layers as well. Ghosts look incredibly empty to me. "Let me help you," he repeated, and I tapped my fingers against my leg in an attempt to soothe my anxiety. I'd done this 100 times over before. Meet a ghost, talk to them, convince them to lay themselves back to rest. And if that didn't work, I had my family's symbols and objects. But this here felt different. Someone with this amount of panic seeming out of them should have manifested many times over before. I wouldn't be able to count how many times I've walked down this way in the past and I had never met him. And someone born from an emotion so strong I could feel it in the pressure around myself would definitely have shown up in the past. It was always the same people. The same lovers showing up, looking for their missing partner. The same soldiers showing up, living through the worst fear and pain of their too short lives. The same victims showing up, looking for justice against their murderer or killer. The same children showing up, crying out for their parents who in their eyes left them. "Let me help you." The voice was urgent. "Who are you?" I asked carefully, taking a step closer. The young man didn't move away, but his eyes seemed to dart across the graveyard, and I could see the panic in them despite their emptiness. "Let me help you," he said again, quieter than before, and I stopped walking, turning my attention towards my surroundings instead. The cold breeze had picked up and it felt like a fresh wave of panic rolling over me every time the wind tousled my hair. And then I saw a shadow moving through the headstones far down the hill. On the opposite side from where Joshua's flashlight was currently flickering. I nodded towards the young man. "Okay. How do you want to help me?" He didn't answer, but instead turned around and started walking down the path, further towards the crypts. For a moment, I hesitated, then I followed. I kept glancing down the hill, but the shadow was gone, or at least I couldn't make it out anymore. The young man stopped in front of one of the family crypts, looking back towards me, before smoothly sliding through the grids of the lattice gate. With one last glance over my shoulder, I looked up at the name above the door, Vervloe family. I skipped through the keys on my belt, my fingers shaking from the panic which was still rolling through my body in waves. It might sound like an absolute batshit idea to follow a ghost into a crypt, but I had my protections and the young man seemed to radiate absolute no malicious intent. Only fear. Fear of whatever shadow had moved between the headstones. I unlocked the gate and as quietly as I could, I pulled it open far enough for myself to slip inside. It creaked with every movement. The young man stood right behind me, a finger laid against his lips, and I stopped moving for a moment, before very carefully pulling the gate closed, deciding against locking it. Then he gestured down the stairs and disappeared below the ground. I hesitated, not daring to turn my flashlight on, then I slowly started to follow him, taking every step with utmost care to avoid slipping and falling. I've been down in crypts before. Usually if I had to search for the origin of a voice or emotion, but never in this particular one, and never while following a ghost down without my flashlight. The moon provided enough light to see once I had reached the bottom, but before that, my own shadow had obscured any kind of light it could have sent to aid me in my descent. The young man stood at the opposite wall from me and I swallowed, then slowly moved to the side. Moonlight was streaming down now, illuminating the originally white stone of the floor and walls. It was covered in dust and cracks, barely cared for in at least 10 to 20 years. "What do you want?" I asked again, my voice echoing slightly in the chamber, and immediately, his finger rushed up to his lips again and he shushed me. I stayed quiet and waited. For him to speak. For him to move. For someone else to appear. For the feeling of panic to disappear. I wasn't actually sure for what exactly I was waiting, but surely not for what came. When the first gunshot rang across the graveyard, I let go of my keys and pressed my hands above my ears. I could barely hear Joshua's scream before the second shot cut him off, and I crouched down into a kneeling position, keeping my back against the wall and my hands above my ears. I stared at the ground. Not sure for how long, but when nothing else followed, I carefully lifted my hands from my head and looked up. The young man was crouching right in front of me, his panic washing over me, combining with my own, while his finger was still tightly pressed against his lips. I nodded. Minutes passed in absolute silence. I had even slowed my breathing down so much that I myself could barely hear it. Then I heard gravel crunching below boots and my eyes widened. The steps were slow. Quiet. Calculating. Searching. My panic rose and I had to press a hand in front of my mouth and nose to keep my breathing under control, and suddenly there was a cold touch on my shoulder. I flinched, but when I blinked and looked up, the young ghost had placed a shadowy hand onto my shoulder, his eyes almost drilling into mine. I couldn't look away. Then I heard the footsteps passing the crypt. Passing. They didn't stop. They kept going. And going. Until I couldn't hear them anymore. I let out a deep breath. I didn't leave my position or moved until I could hear the police sirens outside. Considering they were searching for an active shooter who could possibly still be in the area, I decided against leaving my hiding spot and just walking up to them. Instead, once I heard them making their rounds, I started to flash my light up the stairs and called for their help, stating my name and job. I'm pretty sure I'm suspect number 1 right now, but considering that they weren't able to find a weapon or any other physical evidence on me, they had to let me go for now. I haven't been back to my job yet. My doors and windows are locked at any time. I keep looking over my shoulder. Something tells me whoever did this didn't want Joshua, but me. And whoever helped me somehow knew. Maybe I should have quit the job as soon as this happened, but I didn't. And I don't think I will. I need to know more, and I don't think the police can actually help me here as much as they'd perhaps like to. Maybe you'll hear from me again once I know more.